Welcome back, everybody. This next one might get the award for the most unique title to a panel discussion. We said the hidden truth, what are we not talking about enough? And I think if you, the observation is for you, Dan, and you, Michael, is that I'm sure you feel the same way. If you went back a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and you looked at some of the things that were discussed, you know, AI, data centers, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff now that wasn't discussed then. So we're doing a little forecasting into the future, and we've got two super versatile athletes in energy and power and all the issues to help us through it. Secretary Brouillette, former Secretary of Energy in the Trump administration. He's now president and CEO of Edison Electric. It's an amazing organization that has pretty much every power provider, U.S. utility in it, but also has quite a lot of international power providers. So he is seeing anything and everything that's happening in the power world right now. And that's, I think, the reflection we were having over there is power is cool. Power is the new super cool thing. And then we've got Dr. Michael Weber, and he's got a really fascinating role at the University of Texas. He is a policy professor, but he's also an engineering professor. And that kind of sums up the world we're living in. We need better policy, but it needs to have a strong infusion of engineering. He's also an acclaimed author, over 600 publications and books and things like that. So pretty amazing. The other one that he does that we'll talk a little bit about is he's the chief technology officer at a group called Energy Impact Partners. And so it's $3 billion under management. It's very focused. I think you'll tell me, Michael, but some of the founding contributors were electric power companies. And off of that base, you guys have started investing in energy transition. So that'll be a really interesting discussion, too. So, guys, welcome to what will be an amorphous and challenging topic here, but you guys are up for it. We know it. Dan, maybe I could start with you. You've had this career change, right, over at Edison, and you're dealing with so many interesting constituents, and you got there just in time for the world to decide, oh, actually, we need twice the power we thought we needed, or some obscene number. Tell us a little bit about Edison, what you've been doing, some of the things on your mind in today's world.
Sure. Thank you, Maynard. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And let me just take a moment and thank, I always get confused. I don't know whether to call her senator, ambassador, queen. I don't know what to call her. But Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson, obviously a powerhouse here in Texas, but a true national treasure. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation today and letting me be a small part of this institute. There is some really, really important work to be done here, and I look forward to joining all of you in doing it. And also thanks to Jack. Congratulations to Jack, I should say. I don't see if he's over there. Maybe not. I don't know. He's a brand new executive director. I wanted to welcome him as well. But Maynard, thank you. This is going to be a great conversation today. For those of you I have not yet met out in the audience, and some of you I have, I began my career in the energy space down in southern Louisiana, not too far from here, actually, welding a lot of 42-inch pipe that runs between New Orleans and Houston. So this is kind of home for me, and the energy space is home. And after doing all of that, I went on to do some energy policy work. I worked closely with the senator back then on things like the Energy and Policy Act of 2005, which sets up the regulatory structure and the policies by which we conduct much of the energy business today. After doing that, I went over to USAA, lived in San Antonio for 12 years, and then I started getting my way back into Washington. I served as both Deputy Secretary and Secretary, and then went over and became President of Semper LNG, which is an LNG exporting company, and we have a big facility down in Port Arthur, Texas, that we went to final investment decision on. And now I'm at the Edison Electric Institute as President and CEO. And the Edison Institute, as Maynard just said, represents all of the investor-owned utilities here in the country. We provide power. Those member companies provide power to about 250 million Americans each and every day. And those lights are on 99.9% of the time. And I know that we have had challenges here in Houston recently. We do have things that we need to do as an industry. We have things that we need to do as Americans to help ensure the resilience, the reliability of our electricity grid. And we'll talk about some of the technologies that I think are exciting and coming online. But there is no more fascinating time to be in the energy space, and a little self-serving here, specifically within the electricity space. There are so many things going on. And you may have heard this statistic, you may have not. I'll share it with you real quickly. If you did a Google search today, how many of you have done a Google search today? Raise your hand. Somebody, yeah, look at that, a whole bunch of hands. There have been searches today. If you used AI to conduct that search, you used 10 times more electricity than you used to 2 years ago when you were doing plain non-AI driven searches. That's the type of changes that we're seeing in the electricity space today. And to accommodate that increased load will take a whole lot of innovation and a whole lot of policy reform, and I look forward to that conversation today, Maynard.
Can I just ask you, Dan, while we're on it, did you choose to go to Edison just sensing like, wow, this could be where the action is? Or talk to us about that decision.
I'd like to think I was that smart, Maynard, but I'm not.
And then you got to tell us what you're going to do next so we know where the next storm is.
I'm just a glutton for punishment. I just, I went into the administration. I went back to Washington, D.C. because I saw an opportunity to help shape some energy policy that I thought was good for us in terms of not only our economic security and our energy security, but our national security as well. So I thought that was exciting. I went to Sempra down here because I could sort of sense that there was going to be a stronger need for natural gas, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And we were doing some very exciting things there. And I'd like to say I thought that electricity was going to be exciting, and that's why I went to Edison. I'm just a glutton for punishment, I suppose. I have no idea why I'm here.
All right. Well, because you're a glutton for punishment, we have to punish you today, I guess.
Perfect. Let's do it.
So, Dr. Weber, thanks for joining this panel as well, certainly. With the students and in your day-to-day life, what would you tell us about what you're sensing, feeling, what surprises you, the types of things that are getting debated, the way the whole conversation around energy is changing?
Great. Thanks for having me, and also many thanks to the Senator. I think Senator Hutchinson's built up decades of goodwill in Texas around the world, and that's partly why we can bring so many people together for these conversations. And I would say it is interesting as a professor. It gives me access to a lot of students who I teach, and I get to hear what they're thinking about, and that's important because they are the future, so that basically what they think of to do will have an important effect on shaping the future. And I would say that there are some differences between the students in my UT classroom today versus when I was a UT student. So backing up, I was a UT student, and I did engineering and something called Plan 2, a liberal arts program. And my father was a chemistry professor, so I was born on campus. So I've been on this campus since I was born. And I would say when I was coming out of school in the early to mid-90s as an engineer, and it was aerospace engineering at the time, the key ethic for deciding which company to work for was who paid the most. And back then, a starting engineer salary would be something like $40,000 to $44,000. And if you had two job offers, one would pay $40,000, one would pay $44,000, I'd ask, which one are you going to take? And I knew I was going to grad school, so I didn't look for a job. And so I would ask my friends, well, what one are you going to take? They're like, well, the one that pays $44,000, of course. And one might be making weapons that hurt people, and the other saves puppies or something. It didn't matter what they did. It was just what paid more. But now when you talk to students, it's more of a values-driven generation. They're like, well, I want a company that has my values, which is about a cleaner, resilient, safe, secure future, or opens up opportunities for prosperity. So they're starting to ask more questions beyond the pay scale. They're more like, well, what is a company doing? And are they aligned with a cleaner future or not? So there is a tone shift, and I'm now old enough that I'm a full generation different from when I was coming out of undergrad. And I think that's an interesting difference. So they're starting to ask questions of companies. Well, what's your sustainability plan? Or how do you treat your workers? Or where are you active? And so companies are under pressure for recruiting and retaining to think about this as well. They might have been thinking about it anyway, but they now have to state it more clearly. So that's a big shift from when I came out.
So I think in our title, we're thinking about things that we're not talking about enough. One of them is probably talent, and where we're going to get the talent to do a lot of things, whether it's electrical workers or electrical engineers or whatever it is. How is the energy industry faring in that lens you're talking about? Like how do you think your students are seeing, pick a name, Chevron, Duke Energy, run the gamut here, a nuclear company, whatever, Bechtel. Like how do you sort out what those perceptions of those types of companies?
I think at UT we'll have a different view than a lot of other universities. So if I take the students in my classroom or in my research group, they're going to big oil and gas, multinationals. So there's a lot of students of mine who work at Shell or ExxonMobil or Chevron, you name it. A lot of them are going to startups. A lot of them go to national labs. A lot of them like to go do policy work for a Railroad Commission or Public Utility Commission or FERC or something like that. And DOE, they're also some go in academia. We have a whole mix, and I think that's one of the strengths of UT is that we educate and train for a mix of career pathways, and we don't hate Houston and we don't hate oil and gas, whatever, so our students will go more places than they might have if they're at a different university. So we do see sort of diverse career pathways for them. There is a massive labor shortage, I think. So if we think, if you're in oil and gas right now, you probably have open positions right now you're struggling to fill, and the power sector is the same. The energy sector is missing a couple 100,000 people, especially the skilled trades. So this is a major labor problem. 20 years ago, the National Academies put out a report called The Gathering Storm, talking about the shortage of STEM education going on. And we filled the gap for the last 20 years just by getting China and India to do the engineering for us. And now I think our tone is, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe we should do it here. So there's a push to train more people. And I think it's very promising. So if you want a career in energy, Corey Grindal was just saying that in the prior panel, there's a lot of career options open, but there's a massive shortage. And I think that's a challenge we'll have to figure out. Tech is going the other way. There have been a lot of layoffs in tech, like thousands and tens of thousands of layoffs in tech. And so now I think, well, we have a lot of smart people in tech who might be available for energy. Can we retrain them, or what do they need to know? So there might be a way to solve that from one sector to another.
Sorry, I'm just going to latch onto this one more time, but are you noticing, like, think about a presentation from some of those companies 3, 4, 5 years ago, and the presentation of those companies today when they stand up in front of a room of 50 engineers. Have you noticed that companies getting better at kind of being cooler?
Yes. So if you were an oil and gas company 5 or 10 years ago coming to UT to recruit, you'd say, come work for us. We'll pay you better than anyone. You'll get a multinational experience. You'll work on 4 continents. You'll get promoted. You'll be able to retire when you're 50 or 55. And that was a sales pitch. And then Google comes along and says, actually, we'll pay you more, and you can retire even sooner. And we have as a slogan, don't be evil. And people are like, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. And so now oil and gas is like just saying they can't outpay a lot of people anymore. And so oil and gas will say, hey, we've got a sustainability plan. Here are the things we're doing about the future. Here are the clean technologies we're investing in, usually hydrogen or carbon capture or LNG, you name it. And so the pitch has changed for sure.
Okay, so we're collecting nuggets of things that we're not talking about and should be. Let's put one on the board, which is people and talent and person power. Dan, maybe I could ask you, because I feel like Dr. Weber just gave us another one, which is, it seems like what everyone is discovering about the tech companies. Oh, you guys actually use a lot of power. Oh, you actually are going to be wanting a lot more power. And then recently, some of the big tech companies have been saying, well, our emissions are up, right? We're no longer, like, so the tech companies' role in all this and the potential that the tech companies have to start leading intellectually in a better way. I don't want to be too critical, but Dan, what do you think about the tech companies and their role in all of this?
Well, you're not being critical, Maynard. No, there's a synergy here that's developing over the next 3 or 5 years. I don't know, pick a time frame. It doesn't really matter. That I think leads back to what Dr. Weber was talking about. Back when you were a student, 20 years ago, you might have thought of the utilities as a sleepy little place. They go to work at 10 o'clock, they're off at 2, they're playing golf by 3, and as long as the lights stay on, it's pretty easy.
Some people just said, where do I sign?
Yeah, sign me up.
That
would be a good sales
our,
pitch.
our more senior people are saying that.
Sign me up. No, I mean, that was the image, that was the perception of the industry. I think it was unfair, but nonetheless, that's the perception. Today, I think when students think about it, they're looking at what you said, Maynard. They're looking at this oncoming power demand that's being driven by data centers in certain parts of the country, but also by industrial loads as well, particularly in places like Texas and Louisiana. And what they're seeing is an industry that wants not only power, they want power that's there 24/7, 365 days a year, and they want it to be clean. And it's finding the balance. It's finding the technologies that we can develop that allows both of those things to occur at the same time. And if you're thinking about it in a residential context, you also need to have it be very affordable. You need to think about that in a commercial context as well, because we have to be economically competitive. But it's that balance. It's finding reliable power, affordable power, and clean power. And that is quite the scientific and engineering challenge. And I think for students today, they're starting to see this, perhaps for the first time, that, wow, maybe we can use some of the technologies that were developed by the high-tech folks and apply that to the utility industry to accomplish that larger mission. And that's an exciting challenge for students to have. I got to tell you, from within side of the industry, it's exciting for all of the engineers who are currently in the business. They're thinking about their industry today in ways they haven't thought about in perhaps years.
I guess the other thing that's interesting, thinking of like a renaissance or experiencing, being in the limelight, if you look at some of the big public power companies, Vistra, Constellation, these guys have had fantastic runs in their stock prices. So the world is waking up to these companies provide the solutions that are the solutions to the things that provide the other solutions. So these are really important companies. What would you say about investor? You talked about young people's attitudes towards power companies. What would you say about investors, the financial community? What do you notice there around power?
Well, I think the investment community is equally excited in many respects. I mean, today, if you're in certain parts of the country and you're dealing with things like, competitive markets in an RTO, regional transmission organization, for those of you who are not familiar with the electricity acronyms, these are competitive markets where you bid in for the supply of power. You buy power. If you're a wires company, you buy electrons from an auction. Recently, we saw a couple of auctions in the northern part of the United States, or in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, where the auction prices went up pretty dramatically, roughly 10 times higher than they were just a year ago. Now, some will argue that that's a great investment signal for people who want to provide generation in those regions, and it is. I mean, if you think about it just in purely economic terms, it is. The challenge, obviously, is what I said earlier. How do you balance those higher prices with the needs of residential consumers? No one wants to see a 10 or 15 or 20% increase in their electricity bill because someone wants to send an investment signal to the investment community. We have to balance these things out, and those markets will, and policymakers in the non-market-based organizations or parts of the country will do so as well. But when I think about what's happening on Wall Street, the challenge today in the investment world is not so much, is it a good investment? Everyone knows we're going to use more energy tomorrow than we did today. That's been the history of the country, it's been the history of humanity. We will always use more energy. So there's a good investment to be made there. But I'll tell you a quick story. When I was building out or helping to finance Port Arthur Phase 1, I went to Wall Street what felt like every other day to beg for money for that project. Not once in that entire process did I get asked, are you going to pay me back? If we make this loan, are you going to pay me back? They didn't ask that question. What they asked me was, do you have a permit? Can you get a permit to build the project? That's what they really wanted to know. So as we think about, the investment community, as we think about what we need to do, yes, we need to innovate. Yes, we need to develop new technologies to apply to the utility space as I work in, things like dynamic line rating and things we can do to make our current grid more efficient. Those are important steps we need to take, but we also need to take a step back and think about the policy and the regulatory construct under which we operate these businesses, because if we can't permeate these technologies, it doesn't really matter. We can talk about them all day.
Can I ask you a clarifying question, because we're learning as we go? You said you're a membership of the investor-owned utilities, and that's about 250 million Americans. Is the rest of that power being provided by co-ops? Is that the main structure?
Yes, co-ops, public power, and obviously power being provided by independent power producers.
And so is this another, we're looking for nuggets that people don't talk about, but the structure of the power system is it's complicated, and then you have that big chunk is non-investor owned. What kind of things happen where it's hard to get agreement as a result of that landscape? Is that something we're not talking about? People don't realize, they sort of think power policy is set on high, and it's set in all kinds of jurisdictions with all different types of motivations.
Yeah, it's a somewhat hard question to ask. I think, as I think about my experiences working with co-ops or public power and independent power producers, as well as the investor-owned utilities, there seems to be broad agreement on the part that I said earlier. Everybody understands we're going to need more power. Everybody understands that that creates challenges for the current infrastructure, and I think there's broad agreement, no matter where you are in the electricity space, that we need more infrastructure here in America. We need more generation, we need more transmission, and yes, we're going to need more distribution because people are building houses. And as we think about the changing industries around us. I mean, the electrification, for instance, of cars. We have more electric vehicles on the road today. What does that mean? More chargers in neighborhoods. That infrastructure needs to be developed. And when you talk to all of the folks in the electricity space, I think you'll find broad agreement on that. Now, obviously, because of the regulatory structures in which we operate, there are going to be differences from time to time. Because if you're a municipal provider of electricity, like we had in San Antonio when I lived there, CPS, you may feel differently about certain policies than an investor-owned utility would have. But by and large, on that fundamental concept that we need to build more, I think there's broad agreement.
Michael, I was thinking while we're on this topic of investors and investing and power, I mentioned it, you're the chief technology thinker at Energy Impact Partners. They're looking at a lot of things. You see a lot of things, startups and such, coming to campus. What would you tell us about interesting technologies, how you think about investing? How do you play this space? As Dan says, we all know we need more power. Where should we go invest?
That's a great question. And so I do wear different hats as a professor, a venture capitalist. And I used to be in Paris, France at Engie, a very large gas and electric utility, as their chief science technology officer. So I've seen the multinational world, the startup world, the investor world. And venture capital has its role to play. There's also private equity, there's government funding, there's a lot of different ways to fund projects. And venture capital is well tuned for certain parts of the supply chain, especially if it's discrete technologies or innovative business models. But we cannot fund, say, a nuclear power plant or anything like that, but we have a role to play. And if you look at the number of clean energy companies that received $1 million in funding last year, it's on the order of like 10,000 companies around the world. And of those 10,000, a firm like ours might see at least in a shallow way, like 4,000 of them. And then we'll look more deeply at a couple hundred of them, and we'll invest in a couple dozen. So there's a pretty tight filter on what meets our criteria, and most venture funds would be the same. And we're often looking for a technology or innovation or an approach to doing something differently that can scale, can have intellectual property protection, so you can dominate a part of the supply chain, that is not policy dependent and has the right team and everything else in place to go. And there's a lot of companies out there that require a policy support, for example. Those are more difficult to invest in. Or the scale of the money's too big. We can invest millions of dollars, but we don't invest billions of dollars. In some projects, say a new fusion reactor, those are multi-billion-dollar startups now. So we would invest early, and we have invested in a fusion, but we often can't do the later rounds. It's expensive. So we have to find our place. Let me talk about nuclear, because nuclear is interesting. Nuclear, I'm a fan of nuclear. I'd love to see more nuclear. To build a nuclear power plant costs billions. That's not a good fit for venture capital. But two technologies I've seen recently are around using lasers for transmutation of uranium to enrich. So you had to enrich uranium to get it to the right level of concentration of the right isotope you can use in a nuclear reactor. And that enrichment could be done with gaseous diffusion or centrifuges, or you can use lasers for it and use photons to transmutate the material. And that's kind of interesting. That's a new technology. So that's a place where, that doesn't mean we'll invest, but it's a place where looks like venture capital might invest. And the same kind of thing using lasers for the nuclear waste treatment. So we probably wouldn't want to own as venture capitalists a nuclear waste treatment facility or a nuclear power plant, but there might be pieces in the supply chain where we think, okay, that's a technology that would make a difference in lower costs or improve performance and can scale.
So while we're on technology, as you think about all the various technologies, I mean, the last panel we were talking about LNG, and a lot of that technology has been around for a while. But as you look at the ways in which technology might change, from batteries to nuclear to anything else, where do you see the potential for the greatest rate of growth?
That's a great question. So I'm a big believer in technological learning, that we are, as a species, able to innovate and learn. That's a sort of a unique factor of humans, perhaps. But we only have that great rate of learning if we do something many times. And we see this with wind and solar and batteries because we built millions, the costs have come down and performance has gone up. With large projects where you do a few times, it's harder to get that learning. And so I'm a big fan of anything you can do in a repetitious way, where you do it many times. Lithium-ion batteries have come down a lot in cost, but there's other chemistries out there, better batteries that might last longer or might not depend on China or whatever. So there might be better chemistries out there, and there are real opportunities to achieve some scale with that. So I think anything that's modular, like that has better potential to scale, and will be really
Modular is becoming our word today. We're
small,
all
yeah,
talking
small
about
modular reactors, small modular receivers, or solar panels.
Next, there'll be these
Yeah.
stages, and we move off, and another stage comes
Yeah.
on. It's just all modular.
I might make one comment about liquefaction because the last panel on LNG was really great, and I think back in my time in Paris at Engie. So Engie, a lot of people don't realize, Engie helped create the LNG industry in the 60s with the development of a membrane. So 100% of the LNG containment tanks around the world use Engie's membrane technology. Yeah. And in the 60s, when Engie was doing this, people thought this was insane. Why would you liquefy gas? It's already in a handy form, gas. Liquefy and move it. And we now at Engie still have a liquefaction lab that reported to me, and we would say the same thing about hydrogen. People say liquid hydrogen is ridiculous, and our liquefaction lab is like, that's what they said about methane in the 60s, but we think we can do it. So even in these large multinational companies, there's like great R&D happening that people are believers in.
I just want to make sure we were talking about I tried to pin you down on which technology might grow the most, but I think what you said is things that are smaller that you can modularize and do repeated experiments with and do therefore in scale, that's the kind of thing you're pointing us to.
Yes, and maybe we can divide the world into electrons and molecules. We invest in both. We don't see a world that's 100% electrons. We see a world, although we think electricity is going to grow a lot, we think there's a very substantial place for molecules. So it might be a small distributed way to convert methane into hydrogen, or a small distributed way to convert excess methane into chemicals, or something like that. So that's a place where venture capitalists would invest.
Do you find it fascinating, like if you go back through the decades, energy has always been, it's the Hoover Dam industry. It's the Vogel industry. It builds things at massive scale so that you have low marginal cost. You're now talking about something completely different.
If you go back 150 years or more, it was small, distributed, and modular, and dirty and inefficient and expensive. And then we centralized to get economies of scale and higher performance, and that's the Edison model. And that has been great for improving access to energy. And now we're going to a mix where we're not going to go away from the large systems. We're just going to add some more small systems back in for a variety of either performance reasons or cost reasons or cleanliness reasons. But I don't think we'll give up on the large systems because they still get economies of scale.
Dan, can I ask you, because your time at DOE, the department was leaning into lots of technologies. And I think what we've all seen now is we're talking about how the government can really drive technologies. And there's one philosophy, which is the government does massive amounts of research that would never be funded by anyone else. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the government is intervening in markets, is subsidizing, is taxing, is doing lots of things that are really much more proactive, but also potentially distortive. How do you think about the right role of government in all of that?
That's interesting. The department runs 17 national laboratories that, for lack of a better way to describe it, is called blue sky research. I mean, it's things that, may never happen. We talk about it in very fancy terms sometimes, but these are just big ideas that scientists have and they bring to a laboratory to test them out. I think that's an important role for government to play. It's very difficult for a Ford Motor Company or a utility or any other company to conduct blue sky type R&D.
Well, your shareholders will hate you.
Yeah, your shareholders, your fiduciary responsibility as CEO is to provide a return on every dollar that comes into that firm, and you don't get that out of blue sky R&D. So, not often anyway. Sometimes you do, but the bottom line is that's an appropriate role for government. I do think there's a credible case to be made, though, that some of the subsidies today or some of the incentives that are provided by the government are distortive in the marketplace. We're starting to see some of that in the pricing of things like solar and wind and other things. What's the right answer? I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, that's up to the American people. You get to see every day in the newspaper how the government spends your money, and you can decide one way or the other whether that's good or bad.
I got to ask you, what would Elon Musk, if Elon Musk was in some sort of role, which has been speculated about. I don't mean to be silly here, but seriously, he's a technology person who's a highly disruptive person.
Sure.
If you had a person like that come to government, I know it could be a lot of weird stuff happen, but what might happen on the technology front? The space program. I know this is really out there, but that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's people like Elon. It's people with that sort of creative capacity that I would hope would serve in government, frankly, from time to time. I mean, we all have experienced our own, challenges with getting a driver's license or the post office, pick a bureaucracy, right? It doesn't matter. You sort of want these people who are very creative, very forward-thinking, and very energetic to come into government service. So, whether Elon does something like that, I don't know, but I would encourage, particularly students today, if you have the opportunity to work in one of these national laboratories, or if you have an opportunity to work in a government agency and understand for, whatever period of time, the regulatory construct or some of the science that's being done, man, jump on it. Take the opportunity to do it. You don't have to do it for 50 years if you don't want to. But boy, if you do it for 2 or 3 years, it really does fundamentally change how you view corporate America. It changes how you view the industry. It changes how you view science generally.
So it's interesting. Both of you are business, science, academic hybrids. Like you've had these diversified experiences and you bring them into your new role. And it sort of seems like the energy transition discussion is, at least in policy areas, it often doesn't have as many business or financial people at the table as you might want. And therefore this is a theory, and then we come up with some proposals that are hard to implement or don't make sense. Is that a fair read of what's going on? And if it is a fair read, how do we get more business people into those policy positions?
I might build on something the Secretary said about funding the ecosystem. The innovation ecosystem is one of the things government does well. The U.S. government is particularly good at this compared to other governments around the world. We fund the innovation ecosystem through the national labs. We fund small companies. We fund academia. So we have a well-funded innovation ecosystem. Two other things the government can do or should do well. I think we protect intellectual property in America better than other countries. We have clear patent rights, so you can invent something and make money from your patents. That is not consistently true in other countries around the world. So the government funds the innovation ecosystem and then protects the ecosystem so that the inventors can make money from it. And a third thing I think the government should do, but we can argue about whether it does it well, is set the rules of competition, the labor standards or the environmental standards. Our labor standards are very high in America compared to, say, China. And I think that's good. And these are probably reasonable rules for government. But if you're setting the rules of the market for how clean you must be or how you treat your workers, it's good to have business in that conversation so you don't get prescriptive solutions that make no sense. And there are a couple ways to do it. You mentioned the internships. The national labs have great internship programs. Getting whoever students are here, please do internships to the national labs. At UT, we have the Archer Fellowship, which gets undergraduate or graduate students. There's a program named for Congressman Archer, the Ways and Means Committee from years ago. Go spend a turn in DC in the spring for undergrads or in the summer for graduate students, where you work at maybe for an elected official or a committee or at DOE. And I think getting students in those policy positions, even if they don't want a policy career, even if they want to go government long term, but just to get some ideas how government works that they can take back to their companies. And then rotational programs where we get companies into government. This is the White House Fellows Program. LBJ set this up in the 60s because he identifies there are a lot of good people in society who aren't in government. We need their ideas. Come here for a year, but then go back to where you were. Like, don't go back to your community or your business. And I think more programs where we can rotate through is great. I mean, you came from industry. Not everyone leaves industry to go into a policy position, and I think more rotation like that'd be good. But you said you're a glutton for punishment, so maybe that wasn't a commercial for it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I am. It's you're absolutely right, Michael. I mean, the government does a pretty good job at that. When we talk again about blue sky science, funding the activities there, protecting the activities there. Because who wants to go into a laboratory and invent something and only have somebody else steal it and make $1 gazillion on it? So it's very important that we continue to do that. But I think, when I think about what's happening or what's exciting about going into government service today, yes, it's setting the construct around, that regulatory stuff you just talked about, be it labor standards or environmental standards. That's all true. But you have an opportunity in government to see all of the players in the field. That's another exciting aspect of this. When I was a young staffer on the Hill, I considered that to be the best graduate education in the world because I had so much information coming at me from every industry, every single minute of every day. And I got a chance to see the entire complex, the entire economic complex. And sometimes you lose that if you find yourself, within a corporate environment doing a certain subset of that company. So that's why, again, if you have the opportunity to serve in government, even for a short amount of time, I would just urge you to take advantage of it. You will see more than you think you might.
Do you think it is harder to go from the private sector into government today, well, we'll have a new administration that's coming, one flavor or the other, and they'll be staffing it up. Is it harder to go from business to government today than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago? Are we making it harder on people to do that?
I think it is. I think it's way too hard. I can tell you at the levels, the later levels that I served, it was much, much harder. It's easier to get a job, for instance, on Capitol Hill where you can work for an important senator like Kay Bailey Hutchinson or someone like that, and she will introduce you to a world that perhaps you couldn't imagine, a year or two before you took that job. If you're going to serve on the executive branch side, especially at the higher levels where you have to go through Senate confirmation, it becomes very, very difficult. The confirmation process here in America, while well-intended, I think serves as a barrier to people leaving private sector life going into the government. And I think we ought to think about that, what reforms we can make there.
Okay, so let's fix that. That's our to-do list, one thing. Maybe on the things we're not talking about or things that people don't have a full appreciation of, if you talk about the price of gasoline, if somebody said gasoline is over $4 a gallon, everybody, politicians, everybody gets that. Everybody understands what that means. But if you say the price of power is going up, well, what do you mean? Well, what are you talking about? Well, what do you mean, my power? And so are we going to move to a world where someone says, oh, you're paying 30 cents a kilowatt hour? Is power, it seems like, A, what's going on is power prices are going up, and then B, what's going on is people don't really appreciate it, or we're not talking about it as a society in a way that is understandable.
That's a fair point. I mean, electricity bills look different than the price at the pump. I mean, you see the price at the pump every day. You look at your electricity bill probably once a month. And even if you're a pretty sophisticated consumer, you may not understand everything that's on that bill. And of course, we measure that type of power delivery differently than we measure, retail gasoline or diesel prices. What I think is something we have to think about more in the United States is how we start to break that down so that consumers can begin to understand very clearly what it is they're paying for. What is it you're paying for? And I think, as we think about today, the challenges we faced over the last 20, 25, 30 years, we wanted to decarbonize, we wanted to reduce emissions from this particular sector of the industry. That's well and good, and that's fine. And this industry has done, I think, an admirable job in doing exactly that. But what we've not done very well is allow the consumer to see what that costs. And I think as we think about the future path for energy policy here in America, we should perhaps be a little bit more transparent about what these things cost and allow the consuming public to determine which path do they want to take. That creates a lot of risk. I understand that. And if you're an elected regulator today in America, that's an extreme risk. You don't want to be attacked every time you leave your office about the price of electricity. But it's something that I think is important here in America that we do. If we don't, I think we end up with surprises like we're seeing some today in America, experiencing bills that are 20% higher than they were last year. And people were asking, well, why? Or we look at Europe and we see, the extreme price spikes that they saw just 2 and 3 years ago. And that was because of their dependence on Russian gas. But nonetheless, that dependence was not apparent to the consumers in Europe at the time. So they weren't ready for that price spike. And I think if we're able to do that and able to do that in a very, creative and innovative way and transparent way, then what you'll see is a drive to develop even more technology. You'll drive even more efficiency. People will want more of what it is you're providing, and they'll want you to do it more efficiently.
Can I ask you, Dan, because it's pretty amazing, if you had a meeting at Edison of all your members, you could say, stand up if you're producing power for 20 cents a kilowatt hour or less.
I would never do that.
You would never do this. But you could imagine going around the room and there'd be some people in there who have very expensive power and there'd be some people in there who have less expensive power. Do they all look at each other like one of us is crazy? Or how does that conversation go?
Well, the industry is regulated at the state level. So, you have states like California that are obviously different than Texas or New York or Florida or Iowa or pick a state. It doesn't really matter. You have 50 different regulatory regimes, 52 actually, but roughly 50 regulatory regimes, and each one approaches these things very differently based upon their needs, their consumer desires. So that's why you see the fluctuation in prices. And you can argue whether that's a good thing or bad thing. They are laboratories of innovation, so perhaps it's a very good thing. California is very proud of their environmental record, and they like to say that they lead the nation, sometimes the world, in the development of emission reduction technologies or whatever it may be. But my only point is, as not an economist, but somebody who studied economics in undergraduate school, is that price signal and that transparency of pricing can be a very important, very powerful driver for innovation. So we maybe expose it a little bit more.
Michael, one question for you. One of the things I think that's come out of the EPA recently is, if your coal or natural gas plant does not have carbon capture by 2032, we're going to shut it down. And so at some level, this is if you're pro that, it's very aggressive, and it's going to force us to develop a technology that is right now super expensive. If you're against that, you're like, are you crazy? We cannot be shutting down coal and natural gas plants. How do you think about because you do policy and you do engineering, how do you think about policies like that sort of force innovation, and when they work and when they don't, and then are we really going to do that would be the question.
Great question. So I'm sure there's all sorts of litigation, so who knows what the rules will be, but I do believe there's a role for government to say, here's the cleanliness standard you meet. I also think the government should say, you meet it however you can. I think it's dangerous when the government says, you must do this or cannot do that. Like, I think it's better when the government says, here's the standard, you figure it out. And the best example we have for this when it comes to smokestacks is what we did with acid rain and the Clear Act amendments in the early 90s. And that was a Democratic Congress and a Republican President, George H.W. Bush, that said, we need to add scrubbers or something. We got to do what the acid rain's destroying the forests. And there was a classic kind of thing, it's going to be expensive, we're going to bankrupt people, rates will double, grandmothers will freeze in the dark. There's a lot of that. But then the rules were implemented anyway. There was bipartisan agreement around acid rain. You could see acid rain in a way you can't see climate change. You could see the forest dying. And the industry responded by developing a lot of scrubbers and adding them, switching to lower sulfur coal, or switching from coal to gas. And it worked. An assessment done later in the Bush administration, this is around 2007 or 8, so this is George W. Bush now, his EPA assessing his father's signature bill, concluded that the acid rain initiative happened much more cheaply and quickly than people thought. That acid rain is essentially a solved problem now. And not only was acid rain solved more quickly and cheaply than they thought, but the benefit to cost ratio was like 40-1. That there were a few $1 billion of costs, but they had tens of billions of dollars of benefits from the forests that weren't destroyed, the people who did not get asthma, and that kind of thing. And so we'll see if this rule sticks. There's a lot of reasons why it might and a lot of reasons why it might not. But what I bet will happen is these coal plants that are like 50 years old will have to decide whether to retire or retrofit. They might add scrubbers. They might just build gas plants or other things. So there are a lot of ways to deal with that, and we'll see. But we've had these kind of rules before.
Isn't it interesting? It doesn't get discussed, but a new coal plant relative to a coal plant that's 30, 40, 50 years old, the difference in the emissions profile is stunning, right?
It's very different. Yeah, so a new coal plant, first of all, will be much more efficient. So it'll be 40% efficient instead of 30% efficient or something like that. It will have scrubbers, so have electrostatic precipitators to take out the solids, the ash and that kind of thing. It will have scrubbers to take out the sulfur. So a new coal power plant will be much cleaner. People still aren't building them in the United States anyway. They'd rather build gas or something else. But yeah, new coal is much cleaner than 1970s coal for sure.
Isn't it ironic you could reduce emissions by shutting down old coal plants and building new ones? It would be technically, reduction in emissions.
Let me give you one more irony, which is you could keep an old, dirty coal plant online, and if you're using it to charge an electric car that displaces gasoline, that's still cleaner. The existing coal fleet, if you use it for an electric car, has lower emissions than the tailpipe. So that, by the way, that blows up a lot of environmentalist heads when I say that. But there is reason to argue we should keep coal online if it's used to charge electric vehicles.
Well, we really should have entitled this "Let's Blow Up People's Minds" with this. But can I ask you? We're kind of because we're in and around cars.
I'm looking at a couple of people in the front row. We're reading an article this morning. It's entitled "Energy Ain't Easy," and that's why because there's so many ironies and there's so many challenges that you intuit things that are simply not true sometimes when you talk about the energy space.
Non-obvious trade-offs, right? That's right.
Or we got a lot of titles for this panel next year. One thing on EVs, because I think something you hear people talk about is if we one way to reduce emissions would be to reduce the age of the car fleet. If you had newer cars versus older cars, that's actually one of the most efficient ways to reduce emissions. The other thing you kind of see happening is people talking more about hybrids, and hybrids might be a better answer. And of course, with EVs, we're running into issues around, well, where did you get the minerals, and are you charging it with a coal plant, and can the grid handle it? How do you guys see the mobility space working out over the next 5 to 10 years?
So I've got all sorts of comments. One is because the power sector has cleaned up so much in the last decade and a half, the transportation sector is now the dirtiest sector in America. So the power sector has gotten cleaner, primarily by ramping down on coal and ramping up on gas, wind, and solar. So coal consumption is down 60% in the last 15 years in America from the power sector. So the power sector gets cleaner every year. Transportation sector is kind of level, and so therefore transportation has more emissions than power. And the way to clean up the transportation sector is more fuel-efficient cars. And a dramatic amount of the emissions comes from a small fraction of the cars, especially these older cars, especially for things other than CO2, like the carbon monoxides or the particulates. And so getting more efficient gasoline cars or replacing those cars with hybrids or replacing those cars with electric vehicles will all get cleaner. The thing about electric vehicles that I think is interesting is because they're plugged into the power sector and the power sector gets cleaner every year, your electric car will get cleaner every year you own it. Whereas a gasoline car gets dirtier every year you own it from wear and tear and that kind of thing. So the trends are different. But we do have this issue with the power sector about electric vehicles. Whether electric vehicles destroy the grid or save the grid depends on what time of day you charge them. And if we all charge them at 5 p.m., it will break the grid. But if we charge them off peak, it actually lowers the cost for everyone because now you're using your grid, which we use like 45% of the time. If we use our grid 85 or 90% of the time, it lowers the cost for everybody. And so electric vehicles are either a huge challenge or a huge opportunity, and I would say a huge opportunity if we do it the right way. Because imagine spreading a multi-trillion-dollar asset base of the power sector across more kilowatt hour, more electricity, which should lower costs. So EVs are both a challenge if we do it the wrong way, but a huge opportunity if we do it the right way.
But that's where also we talked about this earlier, the synergies between some of the AI companies or the hyperscalers, whatever we call them, in the utility or electric company business itself. The application of AI to those types of challenges is something we're starting to see more and more of, which is exciting.
Okay, Dan, I've got a whopper for you, which is some of these things, when you come up with policies and you realize, you know what, actually you should charge your car between, pick a time, 12 and 2 p.m., and, and so we engineer all this stuff. Then you cross this border in some of these some of these proposals into, hello, sir, this is the state of California. You may do the following at this hour, and you may not do the following in this hour. And someone says, excuse me, I'm a free citizen. You can't, so how do you see policy and freedom interacting? Because it seems like there's market-based approaches, there's mandated-based approaches where we don't yet have it right, but how do you think about that big picture issue?
That's why I talked about transparency earlier. I mean, look, this is America. We get to decide what we want to do. That's what our Constitution provides us. That's what our form of government provides us. And I think as we talk about these things as opportunities and options versus mandates or dictates, we're going to be okay. Consumers are going to make the right choices if they have the right price signals and the right information before them. They will make the right choice. And I think as we think about EVs, or we think about other technologies that are coming online, be it a demand response type technology in the utility space, I think it's always important to provide the consumer the option or the opt-in ability and an opt-out ability. I think if we do that correctly, we'll be fine.
I totally agree. I think it would not go well if we're told you can't do this or must do that at certain times. There's a better way, which is market price signals, which you can charge now if you want, but it'll be 30 cents a kilowatt hour. But if you charge then later, it'll be 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And some of us might really need the power then. We're willing to pay for it. Some of us might say, okay, I'll just wait a few hours. So that's a great opportunity for a market signal.
Awesome. Well, I will not ask you both about the election, but
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, Michael wants in.
Yeah. So do I have time to talk about the election?
Well, you got 45 seconds.
45 seconds. I would say that I'm a fan of bipartisanship, and energy policy has been one of the areas where there have been bipartisanship successes in the last 4 years. The last major legislation signed by President Trump was the Energy Act of 2020, and there were 3 bills in the Biden administration. The Inflation Reduction Act was not bipartisan, but the first 2 were, the CHIPS Act and the others. And so there's a lot of, and there's, today was announced bipartisan bill by 2 senators around critical rare earth elements, and then we have the bipartisan permitting bill. The election, like, there's reason for hope for good policies. We'll see how it goes.
We're ending on a good note here. Do you think, is that how you feel, Dan? It feels like energy it's becoming less polarized because we're working together because we got to.
I think so. And I hope we return to some of the days. I mentioned this, and I won't belabor the point because I know we're out of time. But look, there was a day when I was working on the Hill with Senator Hutchinson and others. We started with some very basic principles. We're going to need more energy. We always started from that basic concept and that basic principle, which both parties could always agree upon. And then we would kind of move to the outside to determine, how do we get more energy? Is it more wind? Is it more natural gas? Is it nuclear? Whatever. And you kind of worked your way to a bipartisan end product. I'm afraid today, sometimes, not all the time, and I agree with Michael, it's getting better, but we start the process with, a congressman or a congresswoman saying, here's my provision, and if it's not in your bill, I'm not voting for it. That's a very difficult way to start the conversation. It's harder to work from the outside toward the center than it is to go from the center to find your support on the outside. And I hope we get back to those days where we can pass very large bipartisan bills on behalf of the American people, especially with regard to energy.
Well, Secretary Brouillette, Dr. Weber, thank you so much. It's fantastic.
Thank you.